This is a production of Cornell University.
First of all, thank you so much for coming here and allowing me to share some of the things that I've learned over the years. I have been speaking and presenting for almost 30 years, and in the last 2 years, I found out what I've been doing wrong. And I've been working a lot on presentation skills. As Star mentioned, I teach a class at Western Digital. And as some of you heard me say at lunch, there is a real fear of public speaking in the world. In fact, there was a quiz or a survey done of people by Harvard University and Chapman University on our worst fears. And the number one fear was public speaking. And death didn't even make the list. I'm like, so if you're at a funeral, most people would rather be in the coffin than giving the eulogy. And I think our public fear of speaking comes from evolutionary biology. I personally believe in that we evolved to work together and survive together. And if you get up in front of people, you fear failing and potentially being ostracized from the group. And so I think that our fear, however, our fears really come from really physical fears. In public speaking, there's nothing that's going to happen to you if you don't do well. In fact, your audience usually is rooting for you. They really want you to do well. But nevertheless, we do have, there is a real fear of public speaking. So hopefully some of the things that I say to you today are going to help you to get over your fear of public speaking, because I think once you know how, together with practice, that equals proficiency. So we'll talk about some of that today. By the way, I really love the town of Ithaca. This morning, I had an opportunity to walk from the Commons through the gorge up into the university. And what a wonderful walk. If I lived here, I would probably do that as my morning walk every single morning. That is just gorgeous. It's like one continuous waterfall. You are really lucky to live in a place like this. Well, with a presentation on storytelling, I'm going to start off with a question that may not seem as relevant to it, but you'll see the relevancy in a minute. Let's make sure my clicker is working. There. Do you know your organization's mission statement? How many of you, by raise of hands, know what your organization's mission statement is, be it the university or maybe your department? Okay, maybe just a handful of people. That's usually the case. Mission statements, I feel a lot of times, are people get together, maybe executives, and they have a random phrase generator and they come up with a mission statement that really may apply to almost any organization. Well, there's one organization in particular, and this is a real mission statement from a real company. The mission statement is to provide a fabulous customer experience by empowering customers and the employees who serve them. So let's say it's your first day at work and they present this mission statement and you go, yeah, okay, whatever, right? Do you really believe that, or did a bunch of executives get together and come up with this? Instead, what if on your first day, the presenters or the trainers told a story? And this is a true story, and the company is that you probably have heard this, and this was told at an all-hands meeting in the company. The company is Nordstrom. And on July 12th, 2002, Roy Carter walked into a Nordstrom store with the idea of wanting to return 4 snow tires. Well, the problem is that you may know Nordstrom never has and does not sell snow tires. What happened was the company that he bought, the store that he bought it from, was taken over by Nordstrom. So he bought it a few months ago. Nordstrom took over the store, and he went back to the place where he bought it from, the location, with the intent of returning the 4 snow tires. Now, in almost any organization, any store would, you know the ending of the story. Of course, no, you can't return the tires. You need to go back to the company that you bought it from. But Nordstrom is different. They pride themselves on extraordinary customer service. The employee, instead of just dismissing this person's request out of hand, went to his manager, and together they made the decision that they would indeed accept return of the 4 snow tires for a full refund. Now, let's say on the first day of your employee experience or your onboarding training, they told this story. They had the mission statement and they said, oh, by the way, this is what extraordinary customer service means. How do you think that you would take the mission statement? You probably would take it pretty seriously, because now you know exactly what extraordinary customer service means, and that you will do anything to make the customer happy, or at least you're empowered to do anything to give the customer an extraordinary experience. Well, this is the power that storytelling has. And we're going to talk today about a few ways to make your storytelling better. So we have been telling stories for thousands of years, and stories are a way that we can pass information. But not all stories are created equally, and not everybody can tell a good story. So today we're going to talk about principles and concepts and tricks and tips on, first of all, I'm going to talk about why stories and some of the science behind it. Actually wired up people's brains and measured what happens to people when they listen to stories, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll also talk about what makes a good story. Not all stories are created equal. And then how to tell a good story. So today we're going to cover those 3 topics. So first of all, let's talk about why stories. Why do we tell stories in the first place? Well, we are wired for storytelling. For thousands of years, we use storytelling, even before writing was invented, as a way of transmitting vital information that we all needed for survival. At nights, we would gather around the campfire and we would tell stories about how we were able to find water during a drought, how we were able to track down game when there was no game available, how we had to migrate from one area to another when there was no source of food anymore. And so stories were a way that we had to transmit that vital information for survival. Well, we're in a modern age, and storytelling, though, is still relevant. Richard Branson is the CEO of the Virgin Group of companies, Virgin Mobile, Virgin Airlines, and several other companies. Every year, he gathers his top executives together on his private island called Necker Island. And at nights, they tell stories about the organization, the successes that they had, the failures that they had, what worked, what didn't. And he said, regardless of the medium, there is nothing more affecting and effective than storytelling. As I mentioned, there have been studies done on storytelling. And they actually wired up people's brains. They also took blood samples, serum samples, before and after stories were told, and they modified stories. So there was a book actually written on this, and if you want, I can give you a reference to it. But he set up a lab. He told the same story over and over again with very slight variations, and then took people's blood measurements. He took also brainwave samples and determined what engaged people in stories, what made people excited, what changed people's heart rates and things like that. And there are 3 different chemicals that they found that were generated in the brain when people told good stories and told them well. Number 1 is dopamine. That's the pleasure chemical. Number 2 was oxytocin. That's the trust chemical. That's the chemical that's generated between a mother and a baby shortly after birth that bonds the 2 together. And then number 3 is cortisol. That's the chemical that makes us pay attention to something. So when you get something that comes into, like if you were being chased by a lion, you would have a lot of cortisol. So as a presenter, what could you want more than this perfect trifecta of pleasure? Your audience feels pleasure. Your audience trusts you as a presenter, and they pay attention. So stories accomplish all of that when the right story is told well. Barbara Corcoran, she was one of the judges on Shark Tank. A lot of people have heard of that story where people go up and try to get funding for their company. It's a TV show. She said, storytelling is everything. Yeah, if you have an MBA, that's great. and that's fine. Tell me your sales numbers. But if you tell me how you got started and a vision of where you want to go, then we'll talk. Jerome Bruner is an educator, a researcher in education, and he determined that if you take data and you couch it in a story, that you're 20 times more likely to remember the data. So keep that in mind. If you want your data to be memorable, put it inside of a story, and people will be 20 more times likely to remember it than if they don't. The sad truth about most of our presentations is that within 24 hours, people forget about 50%, and then it just goes downhill even more after that. So storytelling is one way to make your presentation more memorable and, even more important, repeatable. You want people to be able to repeat that to other people. Hey, how many people here have heard TED Talks? Okay, most people have. So if you are invited to give a TED Talk, that is the pinnacle of a lot of people's speaking career, because you can't volunteer, you have to get invited. And some of the best presenters get invited to present at TED Talks. Well, Carmine Gallo, who's written several books, I recommend his books highly on storytelling, he did an analysis of 500 TED Talks. And he wanted to understand what the content of those talks are related to emotion and story, data, and credibility. Because one of the things that a speaker has to do is establish their credibility in front of their audience. Well, after analysis of the 500 TED Talks, they determined that 65% of the talk content was emotion and story. 25% was data, and then the rest, 10%, was establishing the speaker's credibility. As I was mentioned earlier, I have a degree in computing science, and I firmly believe that if you had enough data, if you had a logical argument, that you should be able to convince anybody of anything. And I no longer believe that data is the only thing that you need to convince people. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Okay, ultimately, when you give a presentation, you want your audience usually to take some type of action. And so how do you do that? Well, one of the ways, of course, is that if you present data. So here's an example. So let's say that I work for Western Digital. Our company is built on the proliferation of data, because that's all we do is we make devices to store data. We make hard drives. We're one of the two manufacturers, us and Seagate, of hard drives in the world. And then we also own the brand SanDisk, which allows you to store data, cards and SD cards and solid-state disk drives. So we're built on the proliferation of data. Well, as a computing scientist, I believe, like I said earlier, that all you need is data to convince people. So if I wanted to convince my customers that they need to buy more backup solutions, I could list statistics and say 65% of consumers lost data from a computer or mobile device in 2019. And people would say, okay, yeah, that's a lot. But what if, in addition to the data that I told them, I included, and this is a story, it's a very short story, but if I said, my hard drive failed and I lost all of the pictures of the first 3 years of my children's life. Is your backup solution really working for you today? Check your backup solution now. So which one of these things do you think would move your audience to take action? I think the data will lead people, will interest people, but the story, the emotion will lead people to actually take action. And that's what I really believe, is that data leads us to conclusions, but emotion leads us to action. Okay, so let's talk about, so that's why stories. Let's now talk about, well, what makes a good story? So hopefully you're convinced that stories are useful and useful at persuading people. But okay, so what makes a good story? Not all stories are created equal. So there are several things that make a story a good story. So first of all is the purpose. You need to determine why you are telling this particular story? What's the purpose in telling this particular story? You may have a great story, but for the presentation that you're giving, it just doesn't apply. There's no connection between what you're presenting and the story. So take that story, put it in your back pocket, save it for next presentation. But make sure if you want to tell a story, the story has a purpose and it's connected to the rest of your presentation. So the next thing you want to think about are characters. Characters are what makes a story come alive. People. Almost all of your story should have a character in it. And that character can be you, or it can be somebody else. That's fine. But you want to have a main character in the story. Then that character has to want something. They should have a goal, something that they're trying to achieve. Now, they don't have to achieve it in the story, but they should have a goal, something that they want to achieve. And then to make the story interesting, there needs to be some type of opposition, something that stands in the way of the main character getting the goal that they want to get. And then finally, what did we learn from the story? What key learning came out of that story that you can relate to your audience? And I would say if you can't come up with a key learning, then your story, then you're probably maybe a stand-up comedian. And it may entertain, but we're talking about storytelling with a purpose. And storytelling with a purpose, you need something that you learned from the story, or that the main character learned from the story, or the audience can learn from the story, and that needs to be communicated also. So these are the key elements to what makes a good story. By the way, Pixar, probably one of the most famous storytelling companies in the world, uses this formula in almost every single movie that they have. There is a YouTube series called, I think it's called Pixar in a Box, and they actually go through their storytelling process. And so you can go to that and look. It's more for filmmakers, right? People who want to entertain, right? Rather than business people, but it's definitely interesting. I've watched several of them and it's an interesting process. Okay, so that's what makes a good story, but how do you tell a good story? So you've got a great story that you want to, but how do you tell it in a way that's going to be engaging to your audience? Well, that's actually a huge topic. In fact, the whole storytelling topic, I've been researching and learning about over the past, I would say, year. I've been really focusing on it. And a lot of the stories that I've been telling, I've rewritten. I learn new things and, okay, I really need to change this up and do this differently. And one story that I've been telling for, I think, 5 years, in the last 2 months, I rewrote, not completely, but significantly, based on things that I've been learning. So storytelling, even though we're wired for storytelling, there is definitely a science to it and a process and a set of principles that you can learn that really make you a good storyteller. And one of the things I would suggest also is that you get better at telling a story by continuing to tell it over and over again. Now, hopefully not to the same people, but in my classes, I tell the same story. And a lot of the presentations that I give, I also tell the same story. And then each time I get a little bit better at it. Sometimes making changes and tweaks here and there, but sometimes just be more comfortable with the story. Okay, so how to tell a great story. This is the story dramatic arc, and this has been around for thousands of years. Great storytellers have known this for a long time. So everything is going well, and then something new and surprising happens. Tension increases with challenges that have to be overcome, and then the main characters of the story rise up to the challenge, they overcome, and then finally there's a resolution. And so the tension builds and the drama builds in the center of the story, and then finally there's some type of a resolution to the story. So think about that story dramatic arc. And in a lot of the stories that I tell, I also think of scenes. Okay, well, first part of the story, I'm here. And I'm going to tell a story a little while. You can see some of the scenes and places that we're in, but I think about place. I think about the time. Also think about characters, and we'll talk about how to make characters more relatable. But there are a lot of different things to think about when you're telling the story. Okay, like I said, making characters relatable. So ideally, when you introduce a character into your story, you want the audience to be able to relate to that character. And what do I mean by that? I mean, when the audience thinks about that character, they think, oh, wow, I've been in a situation like that. Or I really feel for that character in that situation. I've been in a situation similar to that, and I really was uncomfortable. So you want to make your characters relatable to your audience. And when they start to relate to that character, then they become a lot more engaged in the story and pay attention. Getting your audience to care. So here's one of the ways that you could introduce a character. Well, I used to work with this guy, and then that guy got cancer. Well, that's one way of introducing it, but that doesn't help your audience to have empathy or relate to that character. But instead, what if you said this? I used to work with a guy named Matt, and he was a great guy. He was always going out of his way to help other people. He was head of our charity team. He was always there for me when I had personal challenges. And then one day he got cancer. So you've introduced the character to the audience. Hopefully you've made the audience care about this person a little bit because he was a great guy. And then you as a storyteller also said, hey, he was a great guy to me. Now the audience is relating. They feel like they know a little bit about this person. And then you tell them, oh, and then he got cancer. Now you're feeling a lot more for this person. So you want the audience to be able to have empathy for them. You want your audience to be able to relate to that character. And ideally, your audience will think, yeah, I've been in that situation. That person is a bit like me. So one of the ways, very easy way to bring your characters to life is think of NLP. So number one, a name, a look, and a personality trait. So each one of your main characters, just spend like 20 seconds, and it should be something unique. So I was at a Toastmasters, and I was telling our Toastmasters group, whenever you introduce your character, think of NLP. And so the person takes that to heart, and the very next presentation, she introduces somebody and said, oh, he was tall. Well, that's not really that unique. Now, if you said this person was 6'9", okay, well then maybe that might be something. But yes, you want to have something that's fairly unique that the audience can relate to. One, you want to give them a name. So you don't want to have any nameless characters in your story, and some type of unique look. Like maybe the person was bald, maybe the person was 6'9". Maybe the person only had one leg. Whatever it is that makes that person unique, you want to do that. And then the last one is some type of personality trait that makes that character more related. And just those three things will help to bring that character to life to your audience. Also, use dialogue to make your story come alive. Dialogue is the difference between telling about the story and actually telling the story to your audience. You don't have to use a lot of dialogue, but especially in the very dramatic parts of the story, use dialogue to make the characters and your story come to life. Instead of just saying, well, then I told them I was going to go out, and then I said, well, I didn't. No, actually say the words that your characters were saying, and that will make that story come to life for your audience. Okay, also use specific words instead of general ones. Okay, so here's an example. He was a big guy. Okay, you could just say that, or you could say he was 6'4" and 230 pounds. A lot more specific, and that It makes the person more alive and real to your audience. All I could afford, an old used car was all that I could afford. Well, instead of saying that, you could say a 1992 Corolla with rusted floorboards and a missing headlight was all that I could afford. So use more concrete and descriptive words, and it'll help your story, again, be more engaging. You could say the product manager, or again, you could give that person a name, Maylene, the product manager. Just little things like that, again, makes the story come alive for your audience, more interesting. You could say, I was very nervous. Instead of that, you could actually say what you were experiencing. And this I tell to my Toastmaster friends all the time. Instead of saying, I was just nervous or I was happy, what were you actually experiencing? So for example, my palms were sweaty and my heart was beating fast. Now people can relate, because how many of us have had sweaty palms when we were nervous about something? And that makes you actually start to feel the same feelings. So in a movie, I don't know if a lot of you have had, but in some movies, yeah, I actually get sweaty palms because I'm nervous of what's going to happen. And a lot of times people in some of the measurements that scientists have done, the brain can't tell whether you're experiencing something for real or just in a story, because it has the same reactions a lot of times when there's a well-told story and you're actually experiencing something. And I think a lot of us have experienced that in movies that we've watched, that our heart starts to beat faster. We're wondering what's going to happen. My wife actually, when she watches a scary movie, she'll put a pillow in front of her eye and maybe just look out with one eye. So telling a story on how you're actually feeling, the physical sensations and reactions, definitely makes the story come to life. The client was upset. Well, how were they upset? The client looked me in the eye and said, this is the worst customer experience that I've ever had. That is a lot more descriptive than just saying the customer was upset. Okay, storytelling like a pro. One of the things you want to think about is scenes in the story. And I'll tell a story a little bit, but where is this particular part of the story taking place? And how can you include it in the story so that the audience feels like they're actually in the story with you? Was it a particular room? Was it an airplane? Was it in an interview? So think about a scene and how you set the scene for the people that you're telling the story to. Give the right amount of detail at the right time. The right amount of detail at the right time usually means at the most dramatic part of the story, you want to give the most detail. So if you were late for an appointment and you were sitting there at the edge of the street trying to get a taxi, and all the thoughts that are going through your head, you want to give that part of the story the most detail. What were you feeling at that time? What was it like outside? Was it raining? Was it snowy? What were your palms sweaty? Were you worried about whatever? Instead of the first part of the story where you're just going to the airport and nothing is really happening, you're not nervous or anything, that part of the story you want to give as much detail as you can. And then make sure that you connect your story with the rest of your presentation. Again, as I mentioned, what was the key learning from the story, and how does the story relate to the rest of your presentation? And then finally, story tagline. To make your story memorable and repeatable, have a tagline that you associate with it. Here, let me give you a little bit more detail. Okay, so all these companies, they have taglines, right, that they associated with it. So Walmart, save money, live better. Disneyland, where dreams come true. FedEx, the world on time. These are taglines that are associated with a company. Now with a story, if you can have a tagline that you associate with your story, then that will make it more memorable for your audience. So for example, if I'm telling, there was a story that recently I listened to a podcast, Doug Stevenson. He's been teaching storytelling techniques for, I think, 20 years. I recently actually had a one-on-one session with him But one of the stories that he tells is that he's in an airport and he's late for an appointment, and there's no taxis, there's no shuttle, and then right in front of, and he wonders what he's going to do. He's going to be late for his appointment, and then right in front of him is this big white limo. And so the person comes up to him and said, "Sir, where are you going?" Anyway, so they arrange for it, and he's in the car, and Doug is talking to this person, the driver, and the driver says, "Hey, next time you're in the airport, just look for the limo. Look for the limo." That is his tagline for the story, and he teaches a seminar on looking for alternative solutions and horizontal thinking and how to look for solutions that you normally wouldn't have looked for. But the story tagline is, look for the limo. And people remember that from his story. And in fact, people come up years later and like, "You're the look for the limo guy, aren't you?" "Yeah, I am." So if you can come up with a short, and it should be short, using simple words, alliteration sometimes helps, words that start with the same sound, and rhyming also helps sometime. But if you can come up with a tagline with your story and repeat it throughout your story, your audience will remember it that much more easily. So story tagline makes it much more easy to remember and repeatable. There's a story that happened to me years ago on how actually I discovered the power of story, but I didn't actually realize it at the time. About 15 years ago, I was a product manager, and I was at risk of losing my job, and there was a risk of my whole product being canceled. And of course, the product was canceled. I was at risk of losing my job. I was, of course, very concerned about that. But we had an opportunity to save it. So I went into my boss's office, Doug. Doug was from New York, a very no-nonsense, typical New Yorker. His phrase he always used was, "Justin, how are we going to make money? Justin, how are we going to make money?" And I was in the office with Doug, and Doug pulled me aside and he said, "Justin, I don't think I have to remind you, but our jobs are at stake here. But I think we have one shot. We have this proof of concept coming up with Vodafone in the UK, one of the largest cell phone providers in the world. And I believe if we're successful at that, we can save our product." Well, up until then, I had done a lot of business cases for my product. I had done share of market. I had done how much revenue we were going to make, 5-year forecast, how much profit we were going to make, all of those things. But none of that would convince the executives. And so we thought this was an opportunity for us to maybe, if we're successful in this proof of concept, to save our product. And also we wanted to be able to get from the customer the business data that we needed, maybe additional business data that we could present to the executives. Well, I went off and took our best people and was there in the UK for a whole month. We were there in Reading, UK for a month doing a proof of concept. And we were pretty successful. But the data, the business data that we wanted, the customer said, that's proprietary, confidential. You're not getting any of that. Finished the proof of concept successfully, came back, was in Doug's office again. Doug said, "Justin, thanks so much. Spending a whole month away from your family in the UK. That was a great proof of concept, a lot of successes. But we don't have the data." I said, "I know. What are we going to do?" Doug said, "We have a presentation. The executives want you to present to them in about an hour. What are we going to present to them? I don't have any new data." And then I said, "I can tell stories about our proof of concept." I said, "I don't know how much that's going to change anybody, but I can do that. That's all we have." So that's what I did. Told the story about the end user that they had. And the end user was trying to make a phone call or send a message of her grandchild to her friend, and it kept on failing. And our product looked at the service from a user perspective and alerted the company when the service wasn't working. And then I told a story about Tim, the technologist, who was able to take those alerts, translate it into network issues, address the issue, and so that the end user could actually continue using the service. So we had several of those types of stories where we had successes in being able to determine how the service was impacted. Well, I finished my presentation, and I really didn't think much of it. Over the next few days, I was really nervous, wondering what was going to come out of that, because I knew that our product was on the chopping block. Doug invited me to his office again. We were in Doug's office. And I thought, okay, well, here it comes. Doug said, Justin, congratulations. The executives want to fully fund your product. I was happy, but confused. So why? I'm happy, but why? They really liked your presentation. I said, but there were stories. I didn't have any new data to share with them. They said they were really convinced that if that customer was convinced and was successful in this, that you could succeed in the marketplace. I left his office happy yet confused. And it wasn't until 10 years later, where I started studying storytelling, that I realized what happened in that presentation. And stories have the ability to convince where data doesn't. And I'm not saying data is not important. Data is absolutely critical and important and a foundational piece of most business arguments and proposals. But stories have the ability to move people to take action where just data doesn't. And so Doug, when I left his office, said, your data got their attention, but next time, close with a story. Close with a story. And I thought about that. And again, it wasn't until 10 years later where I really figured out what actually happened there. So let's look at what happened here and the aspects. So first of all, main character, me. So I introduced myself and I told you I was at risk of losing my job and my product was at risk of being canceled. So that there was in the story to help you gain a little bit of empathy for me, because maybe you've been in a position where you could have lost your job, or you could think, gee, if I lost my position, let's say at my schooling, like maybe my department went away or my funding went away, that would be terrible. So that was the first part of the story. The next one, the risk and danger. So risk and danger is always something you want to include. Risk is what happens if you fail. Risk is the ability to fail or the failure, and then danger is the consequences of that failure. So risk and danger will add interest to the story. So the risk was, yes, my job could go away. I used dialogue in the story. So dialogue between my manager and I. Instead of just saying, well, I went into his office, we talked about this, and then we talked about that, I actually included what we actually said. And then opposition. So the executives were the opposition. They didn't want to approve my project or my product. And they were at risk of, I was at risk of having it being canceled. And then finally, the resolution, right? I presented to them, I told stories, and my product actually got approved, fully approved. And the key learning. Well, the key learning from this was the power of stories to persuade when data alone didn't. And then my story tagline, close with a story. Close with a story. Okay, now you may be saying, okay, well, Justin, that's good and great. I really believe that stories have the ability to impact people. And I really believe that your stories worked, but I don't have stories. I do research. I do tests. I do studies. And then I've got these results, these numbers, but I don't have a story to tell, right? They're just numbers. Every endeavor that you are involved in has a story within it. Let me give you an example. I work every day. My head is buried in a spreadsheet every day. I do a lot of forecasting. I do all of the pricing for about $1 billion product line. And I do roadmap activities, but there's not, most of it is just numbers. But let's say that I am going to be doing my quarterly report, and I want to present numbers. One of the things I could do is just say, all right, well, here's the numbers for last quarter. We achieved revenue of $10 million, which is 20% above the last quarter's numbers. And I could do it that way. And that's probably about 90% of the presentations that you hear. Or I could do it this way if I really want to generate more interest, generate a little bit of suspense, and have people remember it. Before I tell you this quarter's numbers, let me tell you what my colleague and I, a little bit of bet that we had. I bet that we were going to come in at $10.2 million, and my colleague over here bet that we were going to come in at $9.5 million. And we had $100 riding on this bet. So where do you think the numbers came in this quarter? Hands up for you to think I won. Hands up do you think my colleague won? And then you say, this last quarter's numbers were $10 million. Little bit of a story, probably not that dramatic, but people will remember it. People get engaged. People want to know who won the bet. And people will remember the number much more easily than if you just presented, wow, our quarterly revenue was $10 million. One of the times, this happened just recently, and this is not really a story, but way of adding a little bit of interest to your presentation. So in the business I'm in, I sell flash memory wafers, right? Those round wafers and that are cut up into little semiconductor chips. So I sell those to companies. And there's a market price associated with it. That's similar to price of, let's say, agricultural items like barley or wheat. And it's called a spot price. That's the price, and it goes up or down on a daily basis. And we've been in one of the worst downturns in our company history. In the flash memory history, it's probably the worst downturn that we've ever had. And it's been going on for 18 months. And then the spot price has gone down consistently every single week for 18 months. Finally, for the first time in 18 months, it went up. So instead of just saying, hey, spot price is up, in my presentation, I mocked up a newsroom. And with Teams, and you can do this with Zoom too, you can put yourself with a background. And so I started off my presentation, and then I said, wait, hold on. I have some breaking news. Then I put myself, there was a background of a newsroom, and I said, the breaking news is after 18 consecutive months of consistent price declines, the spot price has actually gone up. And everybody paid attention to that. First of all, they were like, wait, what is he doing? And that's fine, because I got people to pay attention. And then it was definitely breaking news that everybody was interested in. And I got lots of compliments after, well done, I really like that. And people remember that. So so stories are one way that people will remember things. But if you do something just a little bit different in your presentation, that's another thing that you can do. So there's always a story to tell. It may not be super dramatic. It may not be the most exciting thing, but there's always a story that you can apply to pretty much any data that you have. Okay, where do you get your stories from in your presentations? Well, simple stories that are told well will impact people. As I say, it doesn't have to be overly dramatic. So what I suggest you do, if you want to be a really good presenter, is that you start a file of stories that have happened in your life. And I've done that. I've got a Word document, and I've got all the stories that I can think of. Some of them are just headlines that say, oh yeah, I remember this story, right? And I haven't told it yet, so I haven't really fleshed it out. Some are fully fleshed out stories that I use in different presentations. And then when I give a presentation, a lot of times I'll go to my story file and think, okay, which story would apply? And I go through them. Oh, okay, this one, I can use this one. If you want some prompts, here's some things that you can do. You can use last, first, best, worst. Okay, what does that mean? Well, what was your last job, your best job, your first job, or your worst job? What was your last car, your first car, your best car, your worst car? Boss, vacation, meal, you can think about all sorts of topics. And this will prompts to help you to think about stories that have happened in your life and that you can use in your presentation. This, by the way, is my first car. It had rusted floorboards. It actually had a hole in it. I actually took my wife one time. I had a little bit of cardboard, but it was really windy one day and raining really hard. The cardboard came off, and guess what came up on my wife? She didn't marry me for my money. Let me put it that way. Okay. Some resources. Where do you go from here? Well, here's a few resources. Everyday business storytelling. This is how to take a presentation, and I use this all the time in my presentations that I do, how to take a presentation and transform the presentation into a story-like format. Not like a story that is like a sequential set of events, but your whole presentation. How do you transform it into a story-like format? Really good book. The World of Presentations podcast. I listen to that on a regular basis. Carmine Gallo wrote the book called The Storyteller's Secret, and he wrote several other books also. He used to be a news broadcaster. Now he goes around and teaches people about storytelling. And then Made to Stick. Made to Stick is written by Dan and Chip Heath. It's why do some ideas succeed and other ideas fail? And they talk about how you can make your ideas stick in the minds of your audience. Okay, so we talked about three things today: why stories, what makes a good story, and how to tell a good story. So why stories? It gets the attention of your audience. It makes your presentation and your ideas and your data more memorable, and it leads your audience to take action. And ultimately, that's what you want to do. Now, when you think about in an environment like this, let's say that you're presenting the results of your research to your colleagues. You might think, well, what action do I want my colleagues to do? I'm just educating them. Well, it may be that you want them to take a line of research, or maybe you want them to go check out a website where there's more information, or maybe take a little bit of a different approach to their research based on your findings. There always should be some type of action that you want your audience to take as a result of your presentation. We also talked about what makes a good story. Characters. Always include characters in your presentation. Characters have to have a goal, and there should be some type of opposition in your story to make it a really good story. So how to tell a good story? We talked about the dramatic arc in the story. Every day some character did this, and then something unusual happens. The characters fight to overcome what happened, and then there's a resolution to the story. That's the story dramatic arc. Include dialogue in your story. Don't just tell about the story, actually tell the story, and make your characters relatable to your audience. Remember the mission statement that we talked about at the beginning? And the story about how Roy Carter went to return the tires that he purchased. And think about your presentation. And rather than just spouting information, and the mission statement is similar to that, it's just information, as opposed to including stories in your presentation, and how much more effective stories make the mission statement. And in the same way, how much more effective stories will make your presentation. And an offer. If you want help with your next presentation or stories, you can contact me. Here's my email address, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Now, what I'd like to do is open it up for Q&A. Any questions that you might have?
Thank you very much, Justin. So Justin is not just saying it. I took upon him and responded as why he's here and I got to know him for the past 7 minutes. I know time's up and anyone needs to go, you can go, but anyone want to say, yeah, first, yeah,
If I'm understanding correct, a story always deals with people. As we talk about character, always has some dialogue. But if I'm making a presentation about weather,
Yep.
or crop failure,
Mhm.
a lot of us care about the crop and the
Right.
possibility.
Yes. Yep. That's a good question. Yeah, very good question. There are no, I think there are no things that you can say that apply in every single situation. So really good stories do have dialogue and have characters, but that doesn't mean that every single story that you tell has to have a character, a person in it, or even dialogue. Sometimes I will tell a very short, let me give you an example of a very short 2-sentence story that actually does have dialogue and characters. But I went to my wife the other day, no, sorry. My wife talked to me the other day and she said, we should buy an Apple TV. And then the next sentence she said, by the way, what's an Apple TV anyway? That's a story about the power of brand. She loves Apple products, has no clue about what an Apple TV does, but because she loves the brand so much, she wants to buy it. So that's a story that is very short, doesn't really have that much opposition in it, but definitely has a key learning, definitely has character, it has dialogue. So not every story has to have every single aspect. But I'm saying from the research, stories that have characters and stories that have dialogue get the most attention and are most engaging. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, good question. So with academic papers, I think that that has its own challenges to it. So one of the things that, and I have to say, first of all, I'm not an expert on writing academic papers, right? I come from the business world. The most exposure that I've had was just taking an undergraduate degree in university. So I can't say that I'm authority on writing academic papers, but here's some things that, at least my thoughts that I can think of. One would be I've read several academic papers that start with a story that kind of couch or give some background for the research. That either maybe give a little bit of the history, that maybe give maybe a history of the topic and what's been learned so far. Probably not some dialogue, right? But maybe some story about how we've come to the point that where we are right now and what we aim to do. Or maybe talk a little bit about the problem, especially if it's a problem that affects people, that we talk about the problem that this could address. It doesn't necessarily have to, because a lot of research, of course, is just looking at basic research, right? Maybe it doesn't have a lot of application yet, but it could address that. Or maybe the area of research that it could apply to, and a story related to that. So I think, now, another thing that you can also talk about that is possible is that some of the challenges that were faced in doing the research, right? We had to, in maybe the study setup, some of the challenges in getting a control group, or whatever happened, and how you were able to overcome them. That a lot of times will be of interest, right? Because there's people, there's opposition, there's how you overcame the opposition in setting the study up, and the key learnings. So I think there's a few different things that you could do. Again, I'm not an expert in this, but those are at least some of the things I can think of. where you could introduce that in some of your some of the papers that are written. Yeah. Hope that helps. Yeah. Any other? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Good question. So one, you don't want to tell stories about people unless, yes, you get their permission. One of the things that you can do is, and some stories that I tell, I don't give out names, or I say, you can think of this person's name is this for sake of the story. Their real name is, is different to protect their identity. So yes, you definitely want to respect people's privacy. Always get permission if you want to include somebody in a story. And yes, if you can't, then yes, you may want to change the people's names to respect their privacy. So I can talk about, let's say, the story that I told years ago. Nobody will probably, I've had several managers, several companies. I didn't say the company that I was working for. I did say the name of my manager, but that could be a different name than what he actually was. And so that's fine. It could have been any one of many different managers. Now, the story is absolutely true. I'm a stickler for that. I don't do very well with people who don't tell stories that are true and portray them as true. One time the Toastmasters have speech contests, and they interviewed the World Championship of Speaking, and he was talking about a story, and he said, half of the things never happened in my story. I'm like, are you serious? So yeah, I'm a real stickler for keeping with the facts and what's truthful. But yeah, sometimes you may want to protect people's privacy. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much, Justin.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.